How does a kid from Brooklyn, bullied, broke, and invisible, become one of the sharpest, most respected voices in comedy? And more importantly, what did it cost him? Because behind the laughter, behind the sold-out shows, the iconic specials, and the Netflix deals, there's a story of pain, loss, reinvention, and resilience. This is the journey of Chris Rock, a man who didn't just tell jokes. He told truths, even when they hurt. Chris Rock was born into the quiet rural surroundings of Andrews, South Carolina, but his early life would be anything but peaceful. Not long after his birth in 1965, his parents moved the family north to Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, searching for opportunity. But what they found was a neighborhood shaped by economic hardship and racial tension. Brooklyn in the 70s was raw and unforgiving. It was a place where dreams fought just to breathe, where streets raised you as much as your parents did. Chris's household was tight, both in space and resources. He was the oldest of 7 children living under the watchful eyes of Julius Rock, a stern workhorse father who drove trucks by day and delivered newspapers by night, and Rose Rock, a tough but nurturing mother who balanced teaching with raising a small army of kids. Discipline was non-negotiable. There were no excuses. Every lesson came with consequences. But beneath the hardness was love, unspoken, but always present. And yet, the hardest lessons came outside the home. In an effort to desegregate schools, Chris was enrolled in a predominantly white school in Garrettson Beach, a working-class neighborhood deep in South Brooklyn. The daily bus ride might as well have been a trip across enemy lines. He was one of the only black students, and he was made to feel it. The racism wasn't subtle. It was shouted in hallways, carved into desks, written on locker doors. He was spit on, slapped, chased, and beaten. Not once, not occasionally, but routinely. His walk home became a gauntlet of fear. Teachers looked the other way. Other students joined in. Chris once said, "I got my ass beat every day. I had to fight every single day." And he wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't just bullied. He was targeted, criminalized for simply existing in a space he wasn't supposed to be in. But amid the violence, something else began to form, a sharp observational lens. Chris became hypersensitive to behavior, body language, tone. He could read a room before he stepped into it. He had to. It was survival, and in that survival, he began to recognize the absurdity in people's actions. He noticed contradictions, hypocrisies, power dynamics, all the raw materials of comedy. Yet at that age, he didn't see it as a gift. He saw it as a curse. There's a weight to being different, especially when you're too smart to ignore it, but too young to escape it. Humor wasn't a dream. It was a defense mechanism, a last resort to control the chaos around him. It was the only way to flip the script. But he didn't know yet that his script, one that started with pain, was about to become one of the most powerful comedic narratives of all time. Chris didn't stumble into comedy. He sharpened it out of necessity. For him, laughter wasn't about attention. It was about control. When fists failed and authority figures looked the other way, humor became the only tool left in his arsenal. He started small, testing out impressions at home, mimicking teachers, relatives, and TV characters with uncanny precision. It was harmless at first, just a way to lighten the mood in a crowded apartment, to make his younger siblings laugh during dinner. But somewhere in between those kitchen table performances and school hallway tension, Chris realized that comedy could do more than just entertain. It could disarm. A well-timed joke could shift the power dynamic in a room. It could stop a bully mid-swing or confuse someone long enough to walk away without bruises. For a kid like Chris, small, quiet, and constantly underestimated, humor became a kind of invisible armor. No one saw it, but everyone felt it. It was how he avoided becoming a victim, or worse, invisible. He gravitated toward the masters: Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Red Fox, Steve Martin. These weren't just comics to him. They were truth-tellers, architects of a language he was just beginning to understand. Chris would record their routines on VHS and watch them obsessively, not just for the laughs, but for structure, setup, pause, delivery, punchline. Each performance was a blueprint for how to turn pain into precision. By his mid-teens, He began sneaking into clubs like Catch a Rising Star and the comic strip, often lying about his age just to get a few minutes on stage. His routines were rough, filled with raw edges and nerves. But what stood out, even then, was the voice. The way he'd dissect a situation, then flip it in an unexpected direction. He didn't need to shout or perform antics. He let the truth sting on its own. His material was unfiltered. Sometimes too unfiltered. Club audiences didn't always laugh, but Chris didn't mind bombing. To him, each silence was a lesson, each bad night a step closer to figuring out who he really was, not just as a comedian, but as a man. At a time when most teenagers were trying to blend in, Chris was already working on his angle. He didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but he was starting to understand that being funny wasn't just his gift, it was his way out. One night, Chris Rock was performing at Catch a Rising Star, a Manhattan comedy club, when Eddie Murphy, already a megastar from SNL and Beverly Hills Cop, walked in. Eddie was impressed. Chris wasn't polished, but he was sharp, fearless, and fast. Within weeks, Murphy took him under his wing. He cast Chris in a small role in Beverly Hills Cop 2 and helped him land a spot on Saturday Night Live in 1990. Suddenly, Chris Rock went from grinding in obscurity to being on the biggest sketch comedy stage in America. But he quickly realized SNL wasn't built for his voice. The writing staff didn't know how to write for a young black comic with razor-sharp commentary on race and society. He often felt sidelined, and by 1993, he left to join In Living Color, only for the show to be canceled weeks later. Most careers would have stalled there. But for Chris, that was just the setup to the punchline. After SNL, Chris went back to his roots. Stand up. He poured everything into his act. Rage, honesty, vulnerability, and insight. The result? In 1996, he dropped Bring the Pain on HBO. It wasn't just a comedy special. It was a cultural moment. He tackled race relations, politics, class, and black identity in a way no one else had. Jokes like Black People versus N became legendary, controversial, unforgettable, and deeply uncomfortable for many. But it forced conversations, it held a mirror to society, and it made Chris a superstar. Over the next decade, he released hit specials like Bigger and Blacker, Never Scared, and Kill the Messenger. He became a dominant voice in pop culture, hosting the Oscars, selling out arenas, making millions. But behind the success, pain kept piling up. In 1988, just as his career was beginning, Chris's father, Julius Rock, died unexpectedly from complications after ulcer surgery. Chris was only 23. Losing the man who'd shaped his discipline and work ethic left a deep wound. Chris would later say he still hears his father's voice in his head when making tough decisions. In the years that followed, loss became a grim pattern. His half-brother Charles, whom Chris had a strained relationship with due to Charles's battle with alcoholism, died homeless in 2006. His close friend and fellow SNL castmate Chris Farley died of a drug overdose in 1997. Another close friend, Bernie Mac, passed away in 2008 from pneumonia. These weren't just losses. They were gut punches. And each one reminded Chris of how fragile everything was. How fleeting the laughs could be. In 1996, Chris married Malik Compton, a public relations executive and philanthropist. They had 2 daughters, Lola and Zara, and for a while, it looked like Chris had it all. Career, family, respect. But behind closed doors, the foundation was cracking. Chris struggled with fame, ego, and temptation. He later admitted to multiple affairs, including one with a famous woman whose name he never revealed. He was emotionally absent, distracted by work and women. By 2014, the marriage was over. The divorce was finalized in 2016, and it was costly, not just financially, but emotionally. The breakup pushed Chris into something he'd avoided most of his life, therapy. He began going to sessions multiple times a week. He started meditating, reading, reflecting, trying to rebuild, not just his life, but his character. Then came the night no one will ever forget. March 27, 2022. Chris Rock was presenting at the 94th Academy Awards. He made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith, referencing her shaved head. an apparent nod to G.I. Jane. Seconds later, Will Smith walked on stage and slapped him across the face. The room fell silent. Millions watched, stunned. Chris didn't retaliate. He didn't curse. He paused, smiled awkwardly, and said, "Wow, Will Smith just smacked the sour out of me." But that restraint, that was years of pain, discipline, and maturity showing. He didn't respond right away. He didn't do interviews. Instead, he waited. He processed. And a year later, he delivered the most brilliant revenge possible. Selective Outrage, his Netflix special. In it, he dissected the slap, fame, trauma, cancel culture, and ego. But he did it his way. Funny, smart, and brutally honest. He ended it by saying, "I didn't fight back because I was raised. You know what my parents taught me? Don't fight in front of white people." It wasn't just a punchline. It was a masterclass in self-control. Today, Chris Rock is 60 years old. He lives in New Jersey, far from the Hollywood chaos. He's worth an estimated $60 million, but more importantly, he's at peace. He remains close to his daughters. He continues to write, produce, and create, including the 2024 animated reboot, Everybody Still Hates Chris. And more than ever, he speaks about emotional health, accountability, and the difference between success and fulfillment. Chris Rock isn't just a great comedian. He's a great man in progress. He taught the world that the funniest people are often the ones who have suffered the most. That humor can protect you, but healing comes from honesty. He didn't become great by avoiding pain. He became great by facing it. If this story moved you, made you think, or gave you a new perspective, hit that like button, subscribe, and check out our other deep dives into legendary lives that shaped culture. And remember, greatness isn't measured by how high you climb, but by how many times you're willing to rebuild. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.